August 405 BC, Aegean Potami, the Hellespont. The Athenian fleet, 180 triremes, representing Athens' last hope for survival, lies drawn up on an exposed beach across the strait from Spartan-controlled Lampsacus. For 4 consecutive mornings, Athenian crews have rowed out to challenge the enemy, only to return frustrated when Spartan Admiral Lysander refuses engagement. It's become routine. Deploy at dawn, wait through midday heat, row back to beach as afternoon shadows lengthen, disperse into the countryside, seeking food and water. The crews don't realize their predictable patterns are being watched with cold calculation by the most dangerous naval commander Athens has ever faced. Lysander sits in Lampsacus harbor with 200 Peloponnesian ships, Persian gold filling his war chest, scouts reporting every detail of Athenian movements. He's waiting not from fear, but from professional patience, for the perfect moment when dispersed, unsuspecting enemy crews will be vulnerable to total annihilation. On the 5th morning, the Athenians repeat their ritual. By early afternoon, seeing no Spartan response, they row back to Aegean Potami and beach their ships. The crews scatter, some gathering firewood, others foraging for supplies in distant villages, many simply sleeping off exhaustion from weeks of fruitless vigil. Perhaps 10% of each ship's complement remains aboard. What happens next will take less than an hour, but will end 50 years of Athenian naval supremacy, destroy an empire that spans the Aegean, and determine the fate of Greek civilization for generations. Lysander's entire fleet suddenly appears around the headland, 200 ships moving in perfect formation toward the exposed Athenian position. There's no time to recall scattered crews, no possibility of organized resistance. A few vessels manage to launch with skeleton crews, but 170 triremes, along with thousands of shocked, desperate sailors, fall into Spartan hands without a fight. Among those few ships that escape is one carrying a young officer who will reach Athens days later with news that will strike the city like a thunderbolt. The fleet is gone. The war is lost. Starvation awaits, unless they surrender unconditionally. But to understand how Athens, the greatest naval power the world has ever seen, victor over Persia, ruler of hundreds of cities, builder of the Parthenon, arrived at this catastrophic moment of defeat, we must travel back 74 years to another beach, where Greek unity and victory over Persia created the seeds of civil war that would tear their world apart. The year 478 BC found Greece exhausted but triumphant after repelling Xerxes' massive Persian invasion. As the great king's shattered forces retreated across the Hellespont, leaving behind burned Athens and broken dreams of conquest, 2 distinct Greek powers emerged, fundamentally transformed by victory. Athens, having watched its own city burn while its population evacuated to Salamis, now possessed the largest and most experienced navy in the Greek world. 300 triremes manned by crews who had destroyed the Persian fleet in the narrow waters of Salamis Bay. Sparta, the traditional hegemon of the Peloponnese, commanded unprecedented respect after King Leonidas's heroic stand at Thermopylae and the decisive hoplite victory at Plataea. Yet these allies would become enemies in the most destructive war Greece had ever witnessed. The formation of what became known as the Delian League began almost immediately after the Persian retreat. In 478 BC, representatives from numerous Greek city-states gathered on sacred Delos to formalize an alliance continuing the war against Persia and liberating Greek cities still under Persian control in Asia Minor. The initial structure appeared genuinely cooperative. Each member state would contribute either ships and crews or monetary tribute calculated according to resources and capabilities. The treasury would remain on neutral Delos under Apollo's protection, and major decisions would theoretically require consensus among allies. Athens assumed leadership not through coercion, but practical necessity. The Athenian fleet had proven itself the most effective anti-Persian force, and Athenian admirals like Cimon possessed both tactical expertise and strategic vision necessary for sustained naval operations across the Aegean. The early campaigns vindicated this choice spectacularly. Between 478 and 470 BC, Athenian-led forces systematically expelled Persian garrisons from Eion, Syros, and the crucial Chersonese Peninsula, while establishing Athenian clerici colonies, serving as strategic bases and outlets for Athens' growing population pressure. Picture those early victories. Athenian triremes appearing off Persian-held coasts, their bronze rams gleaming in Mediterranean sun, crews chanting paeans as they beach their vessels. The coordinated assaults, combining naval power with hoplite infantry, liberating Greek cities that had suffered under Persian satraps for generations. The grateful populations throwing flowers, offering wine, swearing eternal loyalty to their Athenian liberators. These were heady days, when imperial expansion felt like righteous crusade, when tribute seemed voluntary contribution rather than forced extraction, when Athens could genuinely believe it was spreading freedom rather than building an empire. The transformation from alliance to empire occurred gradually but inexorably. The first decisive moment came when Naxos attempted withdrawing from the League around 470 BC. The Naxians, having contributed their required ships and crews for several successful campaigns, believed they'd fulfilled obligations and sought resuming complete independence. Athens responded with overwhelming force, besieging Naxos until the city capitulated and agreed, paying monetary tribute instead of providing ships. This precedent established the principle that membership in the Delian League was permanent, and that Athens would determine acceptable forms of contribution. The Battle of Eurymedon River, in 469 BC, marked both the military zenith of the early Delian League and a crucial step toward Athenian dominance. Cimon's forces achieved a rare double victory, defeating the Persian fleet in naval engagement and then immediately landing to destroy the Persian army on shore. This triumph effectively ended Persian naval power in the eastern Mediterranean and eliminated the primary external threat justifying the League's existence. Yet rather than dissolving the alliance, Athens began emphasizing new justifications for continuation, protecting trade routes, maintaining Greek unity, deterring future Persian resurgence. The steady conversion of allied ship contributions to monetary tribute accelerated this imperial transformation. By 460 BC, only Chios, Lesbos, and Samos still provided ships rather than money, while the vast majority of League members had become tribute-paying subjects. This shift served multiple Athenian interests. Simultaneously, monetary tribute was more predictable and efficient than coordinating dozens of different naval contingents, while reduction of allied fleets eliminated potential military rivals and created economic dependence on Athenian naval protection. The transfer of the League treasury from Delos to Athens in 454 BC represented the most brazen assertion of Athenian imperial control. Officially justified as a security measure following a disastrous Athenian expedition to Egypt that had ended in complete defeat, the relocation placed enormous financial resources directly under Athenian administration. The annual tribute, now totaling approximately 600 talents, flowed directly into Athens, where it funded not only naval operations but increasingly ambitious domestic projects. The Parthenon, begun in 447 BC, was constructed largely with tribute money, originally contributed by allies for mutual defense against Persia. Imagine the brazenness. Allies sending silver they could barely afford, intended for warships protecting their coasts, instead transformed into gleaming marble temples crowning Athens' Acropolis. The Parthenon's construction employed thousands of Athenian workers while showcasing imperial wealth to visiting diplomats. Every sculpted frieze, every golden statue of Athena proclaimed, We are masters, you are subjects. This imperial evolution provoked growing resentment throughout the Aegean. The revolt of Thasos in 465 BC demonstrated the lengths Athens would go to maintain dominance. When Thasians attempted withdrawing from the League following a dispute over mining rights and trading privileges, Athens besieged the island for over 2 years, ultimately forcing complete capitulation and payment of massive indemnities. Similar harsh treatment awaited other cities challenging Athenian authority, creating a climate of fear, maintaining imperial cohesion through intimidation rather than genuine cooperation. While Athens constructed its maritime empire, Sparta simultaneously consolidated its own sphere of influence through very different methods. The Peloponnesian League, unlike its Athenian counterpart, maintained the fiction of voluntary association while operating through carefully managed oligarchic networks. Spartan policy focused on supporting conservative property-owning elites in allied cities while suppressing democratic movements that might threaten established hierarchies. The Spartan dual kingship system, unique among Greek constitutions, provided both stability and flexibility in managing this confederation. The two royal houses, Aegeans and Eurypontides, could pursue different diplomatic approaches simultaneously while maintaining internal balance through rivalry. When one king advocated aggressive intervention, the other could counsel restraint, allowing Sparta to adapt policies to changing circumstances without appearing inconsistent or weak. The effort 5 annually elected magistrates wielding enormous executive power served as the primary instrument of Spartan imperial management. Unlike Athenian officials governing through direct administrative control, ephors operated through informal networks of personal relationships and mutual obligation. A Spartan ephor might negotiate with oligarchic leaders in Corinth or Megara through private meetings and personal guarantees rather than formal treaties, creating flexible arrangements, adjustable, without public acknowledgement of policy changes. The First Peloponnesian War, erupting in 460 BC, emerged from inevitable collision between these expanding spheres of influence. The immediate trigger came when Megara, seeking protection from Corinthian pressure, defected from the Peloponnesian League and allied with Athens. This defection provided Athens with crucial strategic advantages: control of Megarian ports, Nisaea and Pegae, commanding access to the Corinthian Gulf, and a forward base for operations against Spartan allies in central Greece. The conflict that followed differed fundamentally from later phases in its geographical scope and strategic objectives. Rather than direct Athens-Sparta confrontation, the fighting involved multiple simultaneous campaigns across Greece and the eastern Mediterranean. Athenian forces operated simultaneously in Egypt, supporting revolt against Persian rule, while conducting land campaigns in central Greece and maintaining naval pressure throughout the Aegean. The Battle of Tanagra in 457 BC demonstrated both possibilities and limitations of this multi-front strategy. When a Spartan army marched north to assist Thebes against Athenian pressure, they encountered Athenian forces reinforced by Argive allies and Thessalian cavalry. The engagement proved inconclusive. Both sides claimed victory and withdrew with heavy casualties, but strategic implications favored Athens. Spartans had demonstrated ability to project power beyond the Peloponnese, but couldn't maintain sustained operations in central Greece while managing threats closer to home. 2 months after Tanagra, Athenian forces under Myronides won decisive victory at Oenophyta that effectively secured Athenian control over Boeotia, Phocis, and Locris. The Egyptian expedition, launched simultaneously with mainland campaigns, initially promised even greater rewards. The Persian satrap had died fighting Egyptian rebels led by Inaros, and Persian control over the wealthy Nile delta appeared collapsing. Athenian naval intervention coordinating with Libyan allies and Egyptian insurgents achieved remarkable initial success, capturing Memphis and besieging the Persian garrison in the White Castle fortress. However, the Egyptian campaign ultimately demonstrated the dangers of Athenian overextension. When Persian general Megabyzus arrived with substantial army and diverted the Nile to strand the Athenian fleet, the entire expedition faced catastrophe. The loss of nearly 200 ships and thousands of experienced crews in 454 BC represented the greatest military disaster in Athenian history to that point, eliminating much of the naval superiority, enabling aggressive expansion. The 30 Years' Peace, negotiated in 445 BC, reflected exhaustion of both major powers and recognition that neither could achieve decisive victory through continued warfare. The terms established clear spheres of influence governing Greek interstate relations for the next decade and a half. Athens retained its maritime empire and acknowledged Spartan hegemony over the Peloponnese, while both powers agreed, respecting each other's alliances and submitting disputes to arbitration. The treaty's most significant provisions addressed the status of neutral cities and procedures for managing future conflicts. Any city not currently allied with either power could choose its own alignment, while existing alliances would remain inviolate. This arrangement recognized the bipolar reality that had emerged from preceding conflicts while attempting to prevent minor disputes from escalating into general warfare. The economic implications of this division became increasingly apparent as both powers adapted domestic policies to support their respective imperial systems. Athens transformed itself into a commercial entrepot whose prosperity depended on maintaining secure sea lanes and extracting tribute from subject allies. The development of Piraeus as a major trading center, connected to Athens by the long walls completed in 458 BC, created a unified urban complex that could withstand siege as long as Athenian naval supremacy remained intact. The Athenian democracy evolved to accommodate this imperial role through institutional innovations, balancing popular participation with effective administration. The introduction of pay for jury service, public offices, and military service ensured that even poor citizens could participate fully in political life, while expansion of the citizen body through settlement of kleroukes in allied territory created new constituencies with direct interests in maintaining the empire. Spartan society, by contrast, became increasingly rigid and militarized as demands of maintaining hegemony over the Helot population and managing Peloponnesian League obligations stretched traditional institutions. The number of full Spartan citizens continued declining as economic pressures of maintaining military readiness eliminated families unable to contribute to the common messes, while growing disparity between the small citizen elite and much larger populations of Perioeci and Helots created internal tensions requiring constant vigilance. The careful balance established by the 30 Years' Peace began unraveling almost immediately as fundamental tensions between Athenian and Spartan imperial systems proved impossible to contain within the treaty's rigid framework. The first serious challenge emerged from an unexpected quarter. The remote island of Corcyra, whose strategic position at the mouth of the Adriatic had made it wealthy through trade with Sicily and southern Italy, but whose fierce independence had kept it aloof from major power blocs dominating mainland Greek politics. Corcyra's conflict with its mother city Corinth originated in a dispute over Epidamnus, a Corcyraean colony on the Illyrian coast, racked by civil war between democratic and oligarchic factions. When Democrats gained the upper hand and expelled opponents, the oligarchs fled to surrounding barbarian tribes and began launching raids against the city. The desperate Epidamnian Democrats appealed first to Corcyra for assistance, but the Corcyraeans refused. The Epidamnians then turned to Corinth, invoking the ancient colonial relationship, making Corinth the ultimate mother city through its founding of Corcyra. The Corinthians saw opportunity to reassert influence over wayward colonies and agreed, providing military support, dispatching a relief force of 2,000 hoplites and 200 cavalry, along with volunteers recruited from other Peloponnesian cities eager to gain footholds in lucrative Western trade routes. This Corinthian intervention transformed a local civil conflict into broader interstate crisis. The Corcyraeans, viewing Corinthian presence in Epidamnus as direct threat to their sphere of influence, mobilized their formidable fleet, second only to Athens in size among Greek naval forces, and imposed a blockade on the disputed city. They simultaneously issued an ultimatum, demanding Corinth withdraw forces and submit the dispute to arbitration by mutually acceptable neutral parties. The Corinthians rejected these demands outright, arguing colonial rights gave them legitimate authority over Epidamnus, regardless of Corcyraean objections. They began assembling an even larger expeditionary force, calling upon Peloponnesian League allies for additional ships and troops. The Megarians contributed 20 vessels, the Eleans 10, and various other allied cities provided smaller contingents, creating a coalition fleet of approximately 150 ships, the largest Corinthian naval force ever assembled. Recognizing they couldn't match this coalition alone, the Corcyraeans took the unprecedented step of seeking alliance with Athens. This decision marked dramatic departure from traditional neutrality policy. But Corcyraean ambassadors arriving in Athens in 433 BC presented compelling arguments for why Athenian interests required intervention. They emphasized Corcyra's strategic position, controlling access to Sicily and southern Italy regions, providing crucial grain imports for Athens, and serving as potential theaters for future expansion. The Corcyraean proposal created intense debate within the Athenian assembly. Conservative politicians argued intervention would violate the 30 Years' peace spirit and risk provoking Sparta into renewed warfare. They pointed out the treaty explicitly prohibited either side from accepting allies belonging to the other sphere, and while Corcyra was technically neutral, alliance would clearly be seen as Athenian expansion at Corinthian expense. The interventionist faction marshaled equally persuasive arguments. They noted that Corcyra's naval strength, if added to the Corinthian fleet through conquest or coercion, would significantly alter the balance of power in the Western Mediterranean. The combined Corinthian-Corcyraean fleet would rival Athens' own naval forces and provide Sparta's Peloponnesian League with unprecedented maritime capabilities. Moreover, they argued the treaty's provisions technically allowed either side to accept neutral allies, and Corcyra's independence made such alliance legally permissible. Pericles ultimately supported limited intervention, crafting a compromise protecting Athenian interests while minimizing risk of general war. Rather than full offensive alliance, Athens would offer Corcyra a defensive pact, obligating Athenian assistance only if Corcyraean territory was directly attacked. This arrangement would deter Corinthian aggression without providing grounds for Spartan retaliation, since Athens wouldn't be actively participating in offensive operations. The Athenian assembly approved this defensive alliance by narrow margin, but implementation revealed the inadequacy of such half measures in face of escalating tensions. Athens initially dispatched only 10 ships under command of Lacedaemonius, Chimon's son, with strict instructions to avoid engaging Corinthian forces unless Corcyra itself was threatened. This token force was intended more as diplomatic signal than military intervention, demonstrating Athenian commitment while maintaining plausible deniability. The naval battle erupting off Sybota in late summer 433 BC transformed this careful diplomatic maneuvering into open conflict. The Corinthian fleet, numbering 150 ships arranged in traditional line formation, encountered the Corcyraean force of 110 vessels, supported by the 10 Athenian triremes, positioned on the right wing. The initial engagement followed conventional tactics with both sides, attempting to ram enemy vessels while avoiding being rammed in return. But superior training and equipment of Corinthian crews began telling as battle progressed. The Corinthians had arranged their fleet with their own vessels in the center, flanked by contingents from Megara, Ambracia, Leucas, and Anactorium. Their crews included numerous experienced marines recruited from throughout the Peloponnese, while ship commanders had been selected for proven competence in previous naval operations. The Corcyraeans, despite possessing excellent vessels built from abundant timber of their mountainous island, lacked comparable experience in large-scale fleet actions. As Corcyraean resistance began crumbling under sustained Corinthian pressure, the Athenian commanders faced an agonizing decision. Their instructions prohibited offensive action, but complete destruction of the Corcyraean fleet would eliminate the strategic benefits justifying Athenian intervention in the first place. When Corinthian ships began pursuing damaged Corcyraean vessels toward shore, threatening to complete victory through systematic destruction of the enemy fleet, the Athenian triremes abandoned their passive role and engaged directly. The intervention of the Athenian squadron, though numerically small, proved psychologically decisive. The sight of Athenian warships actively supporting their enemies convinced many Corinthian commanders they were now facing the full might of the Delian League, rather than limited Corcyraean force. As afternoon shadows lengthened across choppy waters of Sybota, the Corinthian fleet began withdrawing toward their base at Lusimi, abandoning pursuit of scattered Corcyraean vessels. The immediate aftermath of Sybota demonstrated how quickly limited conflicts could escalate beyond original parameters. The Corinthians had technically achieved victory, sinking 70 Corcyraean ships while losing only 30 of their own, but failed to achieve strategic objective of eliminating Corcyraean naval power. More importantly, they now had legitimate grievances against Athens for direct military intervention supporting their enemies. The Corinthian response revealed the depth of their anger and sophistication of strategic thinking. Rather than demanding immediate Spartan retaliation, they began systematically undermining Athenian interests throughout the Greek world, while building a coalition of allies who shared resentment of Athenian imperial expansion. Their first target was Potidaea, a city whose complex political status made it vulnerable to pressure from multiple directions. Potidaea occupied a unique position in the emerging bipolar system, as both a Corinthian colony and an Athenian tributary. Located on the western prong of the Chalcidice Peninsula, the city controlled crucial overland routes between Macedonia and the Aegean, while serving as major commercial center for the surrounding region. The Potidaeans paid tribute to Athens as Delian League members, but maintained traditional colonial ties to Corinth, including annual appointment of Corinthian magistrates called epidemiurgoi, who supervised certain religious and judicial functions. The Athenian ultimatum, delivered to Potidaea in 432 BC, reflected both strategic necessity and imperial arrogance. The Athenians demanded the Potidaeans demolish the southern wall of their city, facing toward the Peloponnese, which could potentially facilitate Corinthian invasion, expel all Corinthian magistrates, provide hostages from prominent families to guarantee future loyalty, and abandon alliance with the Chalcidian League, a confederation of neighboring cities, providing mutual defense against Thracian raids. These demands placed Potidaeans in impossible position. Compliance would effectively end their independence and reduce them to subject city status completely dependent on Athenian goodwill. Resistance would invite immediate military retaliation from the most powerful naval force in the Greek world. The Potidaean assembly debated these alternatives through winter 433 to 432 BC, while secretly dispatching envoys to both Corinth and Sparta seeking support for resistance. The Corinthian response demonstrated their commitment to challenging Athenian expansion, even at considerable risk. They promised military assistance, if Potidaea chose revolt while simultaneously encouraging other Chalcidian cities to coordinate resistance. More significantly, they began recruiting volunteers throughout the Peloponnese for an expeditionary force that would operate far from Spartan oversight, allowing Corinth to support anti-Athenian activities without technically violating the peace treaty. The Spartan government's private assurances to Potidaean envoys represented even more dramatic escalation. While stopping short of promising immediate military intervention, the ephors indicated Sparta would not abandon Potidaea if conflict erupted, and hinted that general invasion of Attica might be launched to relieve pressure on Chalcidice. These commitments, delivered through informal channels preserving official deniability, gave Potidaeans sufficient confidence to reject the Athenian ultimatum. The Potidaean revolt began in spring 432 BC, with dramatic expulsion of Athenian tax collectors and public rejection of tributary obligations. The rebels immediately began strengthening fortifications while coordinating with neighboring Chalcidian cities that had simultaneously declared independence from Athenian control. The city of Olynthus emerged as leader of this broader rebellion, offering refuge to rural populations and serving as coordination center for anti-Athenian resistance throughout the peninsula. The Athenian response revealed both the strengths and limitations of their imperial system. They could mobilize substantial military forces, quickly dispatching 30 ships and 1,000 hoplites under Archestratus within weeks of receiving news of revolt. However, the siege that followed demonstrated how expensive it could be maintaining control over distant territories when local populations were actively hostile and external powers provided covert support. The siege of Potidaea became a grinding war of attrition, consuming enormous resources over more than 2 years. The Athenians established fortified lines completely surrounding the city, cutting off land-based supply routes while maintaining naval blockades preventing seaborne relief. The Potidaeans responded by rationing food supplies and organizing desperate sorties designed to break the encirclement, while hoping promised Corinthian and Spartan assistance would arrive before starvation forced surrender. The arrival of Aristeus, with 2,000 Corinthian volunteers, marked significant escalation in the conflict's scope and intensity. These troops, officially described as private adventurers rather than state forces, included experienced veterans of previous campaigns and were equipped with finest armor and weapons Corinthian resources could provide. Their presence transformed the siege from police action against rebellious subjects into proxy war between major Greek powers. The financial costs of the Potidaean siege created severe strains on the Athenian treasury that would influence imperial policy for years to come. The expedition required not only initial deployment of substantial forces, but continuous reinforcement as casualties mounted and the siege dragged on without resolution. The annual cost exceeded 2,000 talents, more than 3 times normal tribute assessment for entire Chalcidice region, while producing no compensating benefit in increased revenue or strategic advantage. These mounting expenses coincided with Pericles' implementation of the Megarian Decree, an economic sanctions regime demonstrating Athenian willingness to use commercial warfare as instrument of imperial policy. The decree prohibited Megarian merchants from trading in any port controlled by Athens or its allies, effectively excluding them from majority of profitable commercial routes in the Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean. The Megarian Decree emerged from complex web of grievances and strategic calculations reflecting deteriorating relationship between Athens and the Peloponnesian League. The immediate pretext involved Megarian cultivation of sacred land belonging to Demeter and allegations that Megara was harboring runaway slaves, but these charges served primarily to justify measures having deeper political and economic motivations. The economic impact on Megara was devastating and immediate. Megarian merchants, who had previously conducted extensive trade with Athenian colonies and allied cities throughout the eastern Mediterranean, found themselves excluded from markets providing foundation of their prosperity. The city's strategic position on the Isthmus of Corinth, which had made it a crucial link between Peloponnese and central Greece, became liability when Athenian naval power could interdict seaborne commerce, while land routes remained subject to political restrictions. The Corinthian response to these mounting pressures revealed sophistication of their diplomatic strategy and understanding of Spartan decision-making processes. Rather than demanding immediate military action, they focused on building broad coalition of allies, sharing grievances against Athenian expansion. They coordinated with Megarian representatives to present unified case for Spartan intervention, while simultaneously encouraging Aegean complaints about Athenian violations of their autonomy. The Spartan assembly, convening in late summer 432 BC, faced unprecedented pressure from allies whose patience with Athenian aggression had reached breaking point. The Corinthian delegates, led by experienced diplomats who understood Spartan political culture, carefully framed arguments in terms of honor and obligation rather than immediate self-interest. They emphasized that Spartan credibility as hegemon depended on protecting allies who'd remained loyal despite Athenian pressure, and warned that failure to act would encourage further Athenian expansion, eventually threatening Sparta itself. The Megarian representatives provided concrete evidence of Athenian economic warfare, describing how trade restrictions had reduced their city to near starvation, while demonstrating Athens' willingness to use commercial dominance as weapon against political opponents. They argued the Megarian decree violated the 30 Years' peace spirit by constituting economic aggression, achieving through commercial pressure what military conquest would accomplish through force. The most powerful moment in these proceedings came when Corinthian speakers delivered their ultimatum regarding future alliance relationships. They declared Corinth could no longer maintain loyalty to Sparta if Spartan inaction continued enabling Athenian aggression against Corinthian interests and allies. This threat to seek alternative alliances, possibly including accommodation with Athens or creation of independent power bloc, struck at the heart of Spartan strategic concerns about maintaining Peloponnesian unity. King Archidamus attempted moderating the assembly's response by emphasizing risks of premature warfare and advantages of continued diplomatic pressure. He pointed out Sparta was not yet adequately prepared for prolonged conflict against Athenian naval power, and suggested additional time might allow development of alternative strategies, achieving Spartan objectives without enormous costs of general warfare. However, Ephorsthenelaitis, representing more aggressive faction within Spartan leadership, argued that further delay would only strengthen Athenian positions, while weakening Spartan credibility among crucial allies. He emphasized the 30 Years' peace had already been violated through Athenian actions at Sybota and Potidaea, making Spartan retaliation not only justified but necessary to preserve balance of power the treaty had originally established. The final vote in the Spartan assembly was decisive, but not unanimous, reflecting genuine divisions within Spartan society about the wisdom of renewed warfare. The majority concluded Athenian violations of the peace settlement had become so systematic and flagrant that military response was unavoidable, but significant minorities continued advocating diplomatic solutions that might preserve peace while addressing legitimate allied grievances. The Spartan decision to declare that Athens had broken the peace treaty set in motion a chain of events that would transform the entire Greek world over following decades. Yet even as the assembly voted for war, both sides continued, hoping diplomatic negotiations might yet prevent the catastrophic conflict that now seemed increasingly inevitable. The formal declaration of war by the Spartan assembly in late 432 BC initiated conflict that would fundamentally reshape the Greek world. Yet the opening moves revealed how unprepared both sides remained for unprecedented scale and duration of struggle ahead. Pericles, now approaching 60 years of age and at the height of his political influence, had spent winter months of 432 to 431 BC, developing comprehensive strategy, leveraging Athenian naval supremacy, while minimizing exposure to Spartan military advantages. His approach represented radical departure from traditional Greek warfare, which typically involved decisive hoplite battles, resolving conflicts within single campaigning season. The Periclean strategy rested on several interconnected assumptions about Athenian strengths and Spartan limitations. The long walls, completed nearly 3 decades earlier, created impregnable corridor connecting Athens to its port at Piraeus, ensuring Athenian access to the sea couldn't be severed by land-based siege operations. The Athenian fleet, numbering approximately 300 triremes, with experienced crews drawn from throughout the empire, possessed undisputed mastery of the Aegean and could project power anywhere along extensive Mediterranean coastline. Most crucially, annual tribute flowing from Delian League members provided Athens with financial resources dwarfing anything available to Sparta or Peloponnesian allies. Pericles calculated that Spartan society, organized around agricultural labor of Helot populations and military service of small citizen elite, couldn't sustain prolonged campaigns requiring extended absence from the Peloponnese. The Spartan army, while formidable in pitched battle, depended on seasonal mobilization patterns reflecting agricultural cycle. Spartan citizens needed returning home for harvest and planting, while constant threat of Helot rebellion made it dangerous, maintaining large forces in distant territories for extended periods. The Athenian leaders' defensive strategy deliberately sacrificed rural territory of Attica to focus resources on maintaining naval dominance and protecting urban population concentrated within long walls. This approach required extraordinary discipline from Athenian citizenry, who would be forced abandoning ancestral farms and watching helplessly as Spartan forces destroyed crops, cut down olive trees, and demolished rural sanctuaries that had defined Attic religious and cultural life for centuries. The psychological dimensions of this strategy were as important as military components. Pericles understood Athenian morale would face severe testing as rural populations crowded into urban space never designed to accommodate such numbers. The city's infrastructure, adequate for population of perhaps 40,000 citizens plus families, would need supporting nearly twice that number, while maintaining complex logistics required for naval operations and imperial administration. The first Spartan invasion of Attica began in late May 431 BC, when King Archidamus II led army of approximately 60,000 men across Megarian border into the Thriasian plain. The invasion force included not only full Spartan citizen levy, but substantial contingents from major Peloponnesian League allies, Corinthian hoplites, seeking revenge for defeats at Sybota, Megarian troops familiar with Attic terrain, and Boeotian forces under Theban leadership, bringing total strength to unprecedented levels. Archidamus had spent months planning this invasion, studying reports from Megarian allies about Athenian defensive preparations, and consulting with exiled Athenian oligarchs who provided detailed intelligence about rural strongholds and supply routes. The Spartan king understood his army's effectiveness would depend on ability to force Athenians into battle by threatening assets they couldn't afford to lose. The Spartan army's advance through Attica followed carefully planned route designed to maximize psychological pressure on Athenian population. Rather than marching directly toward Athens, Archidamus led forces through fertile Thriasian plain, where extensive grain fields and olive groves provided visible targets for systematic destruction. Spartan engineers had brought specialized equipment for cutting down mature olive trees, understanding economic impact of destroying these slow-growing assets would persist for decades after war's conclusion. The sight of smoke rising from burning farmsteads throughout northern Attica created exactly the psychological effect Archidamus had intended. Rural Athenians who'd evacuated properties in accordance with Pericles' strategy could observe destruction of their life's work from Athens's walls, creating enormous pressure on democratic assembly to authorize immediate military response. Wealthier citizens, whose extensive estates included not only agricultural land, but country houses, slave quarters, and private shrines, faced losses representing generations of accumulated wealth. The refugee crisis developing within Athens during first weeks of invasion tested every aspect of urban infrastructure and social organization. The city's residential areas, designed around traditional pattern of individual households with private courtyards and gardens, couldn't accommodate massive influx of displaced persons. Families who'd never lived in close proximity to neighbors found themselves sharing cramped quarters with relatives and strangers, while sanitation systems, designed for much smaller population, quickly became overwhelmed. The most serious overcrowding occurred in area between long walls, where thousands of rural families established makeshift camps using whatever materials they could salvage from abandoned properties. These improvised settlements lacked adequate water supplies, proper drainage, or organized waste disposal, creating conditions that would prove catastrophic when epidemic disease struck the following year. The wealthy could purchase accommodation in private houses or rent space in few available public buildings, but majority of refugees lived in conditions of unprecedented squalor. Pericles faced mounting pressure from assembly to authorize immediate military action as reports of destruction throughout Attica continued arriving. The democratic institutions that had enabled his rise to power now threatened undermining his strategic vision as angry citizens demanded explanations for why most powerful military force in Greek world was refusing to defend its own territory. Assembly meetings during this period were marked by emotional speeches from citizens describing watching ancestral properties burn, while Athenian hoplites remained safely within city walls. The Athenian leaders' response to these pressures demonstrated both political skill and unwavering commitment to defensive strategy. Rather than attempting justifying abandonment of rural Attica through abstract strategic arguments, Pericles focused on concrete examples of Athenian advantages, ultimately ensuring victory. He reminded assembly Athens controlled more financial resources than all Sparta's allies combined, possessing treasury reserve of 6,000 talents, plus annual tribute income exceeding 600 talents from League members. More importantly, Pericles emphasized unique nature of Athenian naval power and its implications for broader conflict. While Spartan army could destroy property and crops within Attica, it couldn't threaten fundamental sources of Athenian strength: the tribute-paying cities of the Aegean, commercial networks generating enormous customs revenues, and overseas territories providing essential grain imports. The Athenian fleet could retaliate against Spartan interests throughout Peloponnese while remaining completely immune to land-based counterattacks. The implementation of this naval strategy began even as Archidamus was ravaging Attic countryside. A fleet of 100 Athenian triremes under command of Carcinus departed Piraeus in early June, carrying 1,000 hoplites and 400 archers for amphibious operations against Peloponnesian coastal targets. This force represented largest Athenian naval expedition since Egyptian disaster of 454 BC, demonstrating empire's recovery and commitment to offensive operations despite defensive posture adopted in Attica itself. The Athenian naval raids that followed revealed both potential and limitations of seaborne warfare against land-based powers. The fleet's first target was Methone in Messenia, a small coastal city serving as supply depot for Spartan operations in western Peloponnese. The Athenian landing force encountered minimal resistance from local garrison, unprepared for seaborne attack, and lacking adequate fortifications to withstand professional siege equipment. The systematic destruction of Methone's harbor facilities and grain warehouses demonstrated Athens' ability to strike Spartan interests far from main theater of operations. Subsequent raids along Laconian coast achieved similar tactical success while revealing strategic limitations of hit-and-run warfare. Athenian forces could land almost anywhere along extensive Peloponnesian coastline, destroy exposed targets, and withdraw before significant enemy forces could respond. However, these operations, while psychologically satisfying for Athenians watching their own territory burn, couldn't inflict damage comparable to what Spartan armies were achieving in Attica. Coastal raids destroyed individual settlements and disrupted local commerce, but couldn't threaten agricultural foundations of Spartan power or force decisive political changes. The Spartan withdrawal in late July, after approximately 40 days of operations in Attica, vindicated Pericles' assessment of enemy limitations, while demonstrating effectiveness of Athenian defensive preparations. Archidamus had achieved significant tactical success in terms of property destruction and psychological pressure, but failed to force decisive battle that might have ended war quickly. The Spartan army's departure revealed seasonal constraints, limiting enemy operations throughout conflict. Citizen soldiers needed returning home for harvest activities that couldn't be postponed without risking economic catastrophe. The aftermath of this first invasion saw both sides reassessing strategies in light of lessons learned during initial campaigning season. Spartans had demonstrated ability to inflict substantial economic damage on Athenian territory, but also revealed limitations of traditional land warfare against enemy protected by impregnable fortifications and supplied by sea. Athenians had successfully maintained defensive posture despite enormous psychological pressure, but experienced domestic political costs of allowing enemy forces operating freely within their territory. Then came the plague. The devastating plague, striking Athens in 430 BC, transformed strategic situation in ways neither side had anticipated. The epidemic, which modern scholars believe may have been typhus, typhoid, fever, or hemorrhagic fever, similar to Ebola, emerged during summer campaigning season, when overcrowded conditions within long walls created ideal circumstances for rapid disease transmission. The initial symptoms included severe fever, headache, and inflammation of throat and tongue, followed by stomach upset, diarrhea, and eventually skin lesions and gangrene of extremities. Picture the horror. Athens transformed into charnel house as plague swept through packed refugee camps. The stench of death everywhere, bodies piled in streets, because funeral pyres couldn't keep pace with casualties. Traditional burial practices abandoned as families dumped relatives onto pyres intended for others, desperate to dispose of corpses before they too succumbed. Physicians dying as fast as patients, their humoral theories and bloodletting remedies utterly useless against this invisible killer. Temples overcrowded with dying supplicants, prayers to gods who seemed deaf to suffering. The social order collapsing while obey laws, honor debts, or maintain dignity when tomorrow you might be dead. Citizens looting abandoned houses, holding drunken orgies in streets, engaging in behaviors previously unthinkable, because what did consequences matter when death stalked every household? The plague's impact on Athenian society extended far beyond immediate mortality, which may have reached 1/3 total population by time epidemic finally subsided in 426 BC. The disease struck all social classes indiscriminately, killing wealthy citizens who could afford best medical care as readily as poor refugees crowded into makeshift settlements between long walls. This democratic character of plague's devastation undermined traditional social hierarchies while creating unprecedented challenges for maintaining civic institutions and military organizations. The medical knowledge available to Athenian physicians proved completely inadequate for understanding or treating epidemic. Prevailing theories of disease based on imbalances of bodily humors and environmental factors provided no guidance for dealing with contagious disease spreading rapidly through human contact. Attempts at treatment, including bloodletting, purging, and various herbal remedies often worsened patients' conditions while exposing caregivers to infection. The city's temples, traditionally places of healing and divine intervention, became overcrowded with desperate patients and soon turned into charnel houses where dead and dying lay together in horrific conditions. The social consequences proved as devastating as medical effects. Traditional funeral practices, requiring elaborate ceremonies and proper burial of dead, became impossible to maintain. As deaths occurred faster than bodies could be processed, families began abandoning deceased relatives in public spaces, while others resorted to cremating bodies on funeral pyres intended for other families. The breakdown of normal mortuary practices created profound religious anxiety, as proper burial was considered essential for ensuring peaceful rest of dead and maintaining favor with gods. Pericles himself fell victim to the plague in 429 BC, succumbing to disease that had already claimed 2 of his sons and numerous close associates. His death represented not only loss of Athens' most experienced political leader, but also end of strategic vision that had guided Athenian policy since war's beginning. The Democratic Assembly, faced with mounting military pressures and unprecedented domestic crisis, began searching for new leadership and alternative strategies that might restore Athenian fortunes. The death of Pericles in 429 BC created political vacuum that fundamentally altered character of Athenian democracy and military strategy. Without moderating influence of city's most experienced statesmen, assembly became increasingly susceptible to emotional appeals of politicians who promised quick victories and aggressive action against Athens' enemies. The plague had not only devastated population, but eliminated many older, more conservative citizens who traditionally supported Pericles' cautious approach to imperial management. The survivors, traumatized by loss and desperate for decisive action restoring Athenian prestige, proved receptive to leaders advocating radical departures from established policy. Cleon, son of Cleinias, emerged as most prominent of these new political figures, representing dramatic shift from aristocratic leadership dominating Athenian politics since Persian wars. Unlike Pericles, who'd inherited wealth and social position providing independence from popular pressure, Cleon derived fortune from tanning business, serving ordinary citizens and giving him intimate knowledge of their concerns and prejudices. His political rhetoric reflected this background, employing crude language of marketplace rather than refined philosophical discourse favored by traditional elites. The new demagogue's rise to prominence coincided with growing frustration over defensive strategy characterizing First War years. Athenian citizens watching rural properties burn year after year, while Navy conducted seemingly ineffective raids against distant Peloponnesian targets, demanded more aggressive action, bringing conflict to decisive conclusion. Cleon understood these popular sentiments and crafted political message around promises of military victory achieved through superior Athenian resources and imperial power. The first major test of this new political climate came with revolt of Mytilene in 428 BC, when largest city on Lesbos attempted withdrawing from Delian League and aligning with Sparta. The Mytileneans had carefully prepared their rebellion, constructing new fortifications with Spartan financial assistance, while secretly negotiating military support from other Peloponnesian League members. Their revolt represented most serious challenge to Athenian imperial authority since war's beginning, threatening to inspire similar defections throughout Aegean if Athens failed, responding with overwhelming force. The Mytilenean conspiracy had been developing for several years, with oligarchic leaders maintaining covert communications with Spartan agents, while publicly professing loyalty to Athens. The conspirators timed revolt to coincide with annual Spartan invasion of Attica, calculating Athenian forces would be too dispersed to respond effectively to simultaneous threats in multiple theaters. They'd also secured promises of naval support from Corinth and other maritime allies, hoping to break Athenian blockade inevitably following their independence declaration. The Athenian response revealed both empires' continued military capabilities and increasingly harsh methods characterizing imperial administration under democratic pressure. The assembly immediately authorized dispatch of 40 triremes under Paches, followed by additional reinforcements bringing total siege force to over 100 vessels. This massive naval commitment, representing nearly one-third Athens' available fleet, demonstrated empire's determination to crush revolt regardless of cost. The siege of Mytilene that followed became grinding test of endurance, lasting over a year and consuming enormous resources while revealing limitations of naval blockade against well-fortified city with determined defenders. The Athenian fleet established bases on nearby islands and constructed fortified positions on Lesbos itself. But cities' strong walls and adequate food supplies enabled prolonged resistance. Mytileneans had stockpiled grain and essential supplies before declaring revolt. While fishing boats and small vessels could occasionally slip through Athenian blockade, providing limited resupply, the arrival of small Spartan squadron under Alcidas in spring 427 BC briefly raised Mytilenean hopes for effective relief. But Spartan commanders' cautious approach revealed limitations of Peloponnesian naval capabilities. Alcidas commanded only 42 ships, insufficient to challenge much larger Athenian fleet directly, and his crews lacked experience in complex maneuvers required for effective naval combat. When Athenian scouts reported Spartan approach, Alcidas chose withdrawal rather than risking decisive engagement that might eliminate Sparta's modest naval forces entirely. The collapse of Mytilenean resistance in summer 427 BC occurred suddenly when cities' food supplies reached critical levels and popular discontent with oligarchic leadership reached breaking point. The common citizens who'd never enthusiastically supported revolt and now faced starvation opened negotiations with Athenian commanders for terms of surrender. The oligarchs, recognizing their position had become hopeless, attempted negotiating their own separate agreement, but found Athenian patience exhausted by prolonged siege. The debate that followed an Athenian assembly over appropriate punishment for Mytilene revealed transformation of democratic discourse under pressure of prolonged warfare. Cleon advocated complete destruction of city and execution of all adult male citizens, arguing such harsh measures were necessary to deter future revolts and demonstrate Athenian resolve. His speech, as recorded by Thucydides, reflected brutal logic of imperial control and demagogues' understanding of popular emotions shaped by years of suffering and sacrifice. Cleon's argument rested on premise that mercy toward rebellious allies would be interpreted as weakness and encourage further defections, ultimately destroying empire. He pointed out Mytileneans had enjoyed favorable treatment under Athenian rule, paying reduced tribute and maintaining local autonomy, yet still chose revolt at first opportunity. This betrayal, he argued, demonstrated gratitude and moderation were ineffective tools for maintaining imperial control, and only fear of overwhelming punishment could ensure continued loyalty. The demagogue also appealed to popular resentment over costs of suppressing revolt, emphasizing enormous financial expenditure and lives lost during prolonged siege. He calculated these costs in terms ordinary citizens could understand, noting tribute that would have been collected from Mytilene and other allied cities could have funded significant public works or provided direct payments to Athenian citizens. Revolt had not only cost Athens money and lives, but deprived city of resources rightfully belonging to imperial power. The initial assembly vote supported Cleon's proposal for mass execution, with majority of citizens convinced harsh punishment was necessary, maintaining imperial discipline. A trireme was immediately dispatched to siege commanders, with orders implementing death sentences as soon as possible. However, extreme nature of decision created immediate second thoughts among many citizens who'd voted for measure in heat of emotional rhetoric, but now contemplated its practical implications. The following day's assembly meeting, convened at request of citizens wishing to reconsider previous decision, featured one of most significant debates in Athenian democratic history. Diodotus, son of Eucrates, emerged as primary opponent of Cleon's policy, crafting arguments challenging both practical effectiveness and moral justification of mass execution. His speech represented not only defense of Mytileneans, but broader critique of increasingly harsh direction of Athenian imperial policy. Diodotus argued, proposed punishment would actually weaken Athenian imperial control by eliminating distinction between moderate resistance and total rebellion. If cities knew any challenge to Athenian authority would result in complete destruction, they'd have no incentive to surrender quickly when revolts failed. Instead, they'd fight to death, making future sieges longer and more expensive, while encouraging desperate resistance, costing additional Athenian lives. The moderate leader also emphasized practical benefits of preserving Mytilene's population and economic capacity. The city's skilled craftsmen, experienced sailors, and productive agricultural lands represented valuable imperial assets permanently lost through mass execution. A more measured punishment, executing only revolt's leaders while preserving general population, would maintain these resources while still demonstrating Athenian power and resolve. The final vote narrowly favored Diodotus's position, leading to immediate dispatch of second trireme, with revised orders limiting executions to approximately 1,000 oligarchic leaders, while sparing general population. The famous race between two ships, with second trireme arriving just as siege commanders were preparing to implement mass executions, demonstrated both speed of ancient communications and dramatic consequences of democratic decision-making during wartime. The success of Athenian forces in suppressing Mytilenean revolt encouraged more aggressive military operations, culminating in remarkable Pylos campaign of 425 BC. This operation began almost accidentally when Athenian fleet under Demosthenes was forced seeking shelter from storms at desolate promontory of Pylos on western coast of Messenia. Strategic possibilities of this position, commanding entrance to Bay of Navarino and providing access to Helot populations in Messenian interior, quickly became apparent to experienced general. Demosthenes had already established reputation for innovative military tactics through operations in western Greece, where he'd experimented with light-armed troops and unconventional strategies departing from traditional hoplite warfare. His decision to fortify Pylos reflected willingness to exploit unexpected opportunities while demonstrating understanding of Spartan vulnerabilities. The position offered multiple advantages: secure base for Athenian naval operations in hostile waters, threat to Spartan communications with allies in western Greece, and most importantly, sanctuary for runaway Helots, who might provide intelligence and military assistance. The Spartan response to Athenian fortification of Pylos revealed both recognition of position's strategic importance and confidence in traditional military methods. King Agis, conducting annual invasion of Attica, immediately abandoned campaign and marched army back to Peloponnese to deal with unexpected threat. Simultaneously, Spartan fleet positioned at Corcyra, supporting operations in western Greece, received orders returning immediately to Laconian waters. The Spartan plan for eliminating Athenian position demonstrated traditional preference for direct assault over prolonged siege operations. They positioned land forces on mainland facing Pylos, while deploying fleet to prevent Athenian naval reinforcement. Most critically, they landed force of 420 hoplites on island of Spacteria, guarding southern entrance to Bay of Navarino, intending to prevent Athenian ships from using protected anchorage behind island. This deployment reflected sound tactical thinking based on traditional assumptions about naval warfare, but failed accounting for superior seamanship and tactical flexibility of Athenian crews. When main Athenian fleet under Eurymedon arrived to relieve Demosthenes, they achieved complete tactical surprise by attacking Spartan fleet from multiple directions simultaneously. Athenian triremes, operating in familiar waters and commanded by experienced officers, systematically destroyed or captured most Spartan vessels while suffering minimal losses themselves. The naval battle's outcome created unprecedented situation neither side had anticipated. The Spartan hoplites on Sphacteria, originally positioned to support fleet operations, now found themselves completely isolated on barren island with limited food and water supplies. Athenian fleet controlled surrounding waters, making resupply impossible while preventing any evacuation of stranded troops. For first time in memory, Spartan hoplites faced prospect of surrender or starvation without possibility of honorable death in battle. The psychological impact of this situation extended far beyond immediate military significance. The 420 Spartans trapped on Sphacteria included representatives of some of Sparta's most prominent families, Spartiates, whose capture would create unprecedented diplomatic leverage for Athens. Spartan society, organized around concepts of military honor and heroic death in battle, had no precedent for dealing with potential surrender of elite troops under circumstances offering no possibility of glorious sacrifice. The Spartan peace overtures that followed demonstrated willingness to make substantial concessions, securing release of trapped soldiers. Spartan ambassadors arrived in Athens with proposals including ending war, withdrawing from Attica permanently, and providing guarantees of Athenian security, representing major strategic victories for empire. These negotiations revealed Spartan recognition that Pylos' situation threatened not only lives of individual soldiers, but fundamental prestige, maintaining their hegemonic position throughout Greek world. Cleon's intervention in these peace negotiations demonstrated understanding of popular psychology and commitment to maximizing Athenian advantages through aggressive diplomacy. He argued Spartan desperation created opportunities for extracting concessions impossible under normal circumstances, and advocated rejecting peace offers in favor of demanding additional territorial gains and reparations. His position reflected both genuine strategic calculation and recognition that successful conclusion of Pylos' affair could establish his reputation as Athens' most effective war leader. The demagogue's decision to personally assume command of operations at Sphacteria represented calculated political risk, demonstrating confidence in Athenian military superiority. When critics in assembly questioned his ability to complete capture of Spartan troops, Cleon dramatically accepted full responsibility for operation while promising to achieve success within 20 days. This public commitment created enormous pressure for rapid results, while providing Cleon with opportunity to claim credit for what would become one of Athens' most spectacular military victories. The assault on Sphacteria that followed revealed effectiveness of innovative tactics combining traditional hoplite forces with light-armed troops and archers. Demosthenes, who retained operational command while Cleon provided political leadership, had studied island's terrain carefully and developed plan exploiting Spartan tactical limitations. The rocky, brush-covered landscape of Sphacteria negated advantages of heavy armor and close formation fighting, making Spartan hoplites nearly invincible in conventional battles. The Athenian landing force included 800 hoplites supported by large numbers of light-armed troops drawn from allied cities throughout empire. These peltasts and archers, experienced in irregular warfare and comfortable fighting in broken terrain, could harass Spartan formation while remaining beyond reach of their bronze-tipped spears. The psychological effect of this constant harassment, combined with physical exhaustion caused by wearing heavy armor in summer heat without adequate water, gradually broke down Spartan resistance. The final surrender of 292 surviving Spartans marked unprecedented moment in Greek military history. Never before had Spartan hoplites laid down arms and accepted captivity rather than fighting to death. The prisoners included 120 actual Spartiates, members of citizen elite, whose capture provided Athens with diplomatic leverage, influencing war's course for years to come. The psychological impact of this surrender reverberated throughout Greek world, challenging fundamental assumptions about Spartan military invincibility and encouraging Athens' allies while demoralizing Spartan supporters. Cleon's triumph at Pylos established his position as Athens' dominant political figure while validating aggressive approach to military strategy. The demagogue had successfully combined popular appeal with genuine military achievement, demonstrating democratic leadership could produce results matching or exceeding those of traditional aristocratic commanders. His success encouraged similar politicians throughout Greek world, while contributing to broader democratization of political leadership characterizing this period. However, very qualities making Cleon effective in domestic politics and siege warfare would prove less suitable for complex diplomatic and strategic challenges emerging as war evolved. His confidence in Athenian military superiority and contempt for compromise solutions would eventually lead to overextension and strategic miscalculations, costing Athens dearly. The Spartan response to their humiliation at Pylos would take form of brilliant campaign in northern Greece, ultimately claiming both Cleon's life and Athens' most important ally in region. Brasidas, Spartan commander, emerging as Cleon's primary antagonist, represented everything traditional Spartan military culture valued most highly. Unlike cautious kings directing Spartan strategy during war's early years, Brasidas combined personal courage with strategic innovation and diplomatic skill, enabling remarkable success despite limited resources. His appointment to command operations in Thrace reflected Spartan recognition that conventional strategies had failed. Achieving decisive results and new approaches were necessary, countering Athenian advantages. The Spartan decision opening northern front represented fundamental shift in strategic thinking, acknowledging limitations of traditional invasion tactics while exploiting Athenian vulnerabilities in distant territories. Thrace offered multiple advantages for Spartan operations. Region contained numerous cities chafing under Athenian imperial control. Terrain favored land-based forces over naval operations, and most importantly, area included Amphipolis, whose timber resources and strategic position made it one of Athens' most valuable possessions. Brasidas's march north with force of 1,700 hoplites demonstrated Spartan willingness, taking unprecedented risks to achieve strategic objectives. The expedition required passage through hostile or neutral territory, coordination with local allies whose loyalty remained uncertain, and sustained operations far from any possibility of reinforcement or resupply from Peloponnese. Success would depend entirely on Brasidas's ability to inspire local populations to revolt against Athenian control, while defeating any imperial forces dispatched to restore order. The death of Brasidas at Amphipolis in 422 BC, occurring on same battlefield, claiming Cleon's life, removed two most aggressive advocates of continued warfare from their respective cities and created unprecedented opportunities for diplomatic resolution. Mutual exhaustion of both Athens and Sparta after a decade of inconclusive fighting had drained treasuries, decimated populations, and demonstrated limitations of each side's strategic advantages. Spartan assembly faced with ongoing humiliation of captured citizens held in Athenian prisons and persistent threat of Helot rebellion, encouraged by Athenian operations at Pylos, found itself increasingly receptive to peace negotiations, restoring traditional prestige while securing return of starring hostages. Nicias, son of Niceratus, emerged as primary architect of Athenian peace policy during this crucial period. Unlike Cleon, whose political success had depended on appealing to popular emotions and promising quick military victories, Nicias represented conservative property-owning classes whose wealth had been steadily eroded by costs of prolonged warfare. His extensive silver mining operations in Larium had provided enormous personal fortune, but disruption of trade routes and expense of maintaining large military forces had reduced profitability of such enterprises while creating pressure for more sustainable policies. The Peace of Nicias, negotiated in 421 BC, reflected compromises satisfying neither side's maximum objectives while providing sufficient benefits to justify ratification by their respective assemblies. Athens would recover Pylos and strategic island of Cythera, eliminating Spartan bases threatening Helot loyalty and providing platforms for attacks on Athenian commerce. In return, Sparta would regain Nicaea and several other positions captured during Athenian raids, while both sides agreed restoring all other conquered territories to pre-war status. The prisoner exchange arrangements demonstrated particular importance Spartan society placed on recovering captured citizens, whose continued imprisonment represented unprecedented challenge to traditional concepts of military honor. The 292 Spartans taken at Sphacteria, including 120 full citizens whose families represented core of Spartan political leadership, had become powerful symbols of Athenian military success and diplomatic leverage. Their release required corresponding Athenian concessions, including return of all Spartan prisoners taken during various campaigns and guarantees Pylos wouldn't be used as base for encouraging further Helot rebellions. The 50-year alliance provision represented most ambitious aspect of peace settlement, establishing framework for long-term cooperation, going far beyond simple cessation of hostilities. This defensive pact obligated each power to assist the other against external threats, while creating mechanisms for resolving future disputes through arbitration rather than warfare. Alliance reflected recognition by moderate leaders in both cities that fundamental interests weren't necessarily incompatible, and cooperation might serve mutual benefit against emerging challenges from other powers. However, ratification process in both cities revealed significant opposition, undermining treaties' effectiveness from inception. In Sparta, Ephors faced criticism from allies, feeling betrayed by separate peace with Athens, and from military commanders arguing continued warfare offered better prospects for decisive victory. Corinthians, in particular, expressed outrage at provisions failing to address their specific grievances against Athenian commercial policies and leaving colonial interests vulnerable to continued imperial pressure. The formation of alternative alliance system emerging in 420 BC represented most serious challenge to peace of Nicias, and demonstrated how quickly fragile diplomatic settlement could unravel under pressure from dissatisfied parties. Argos, which had remained neutral during Achaemenian War while rebuilding military strength, emerged as leader of coalition, offering alternative to bipolar system dominated by Athens and Sparta. The Argive alliance initially included Mantinea and Elis, both having specific grievances against Spartan policies the Peace of Nicias failed addressing. Mantinea resented Spartan interference in Arcadian affairs and sought greater autonomy for region's traditional democratic institutions, while Elis objected to Spartan violations of Olympic neutrality and demanded recognition of special religious prerogatives. The Athenian decision joining this alliance represented dramatic departure from moderate policies Nicias had advocated and reflected growing influence of Alcibiades in Athenian political life. The young politician, whose family connections and personal charisma had already established him as rising force in democratic politics, argued Argive alliance offered Athens opportunities, expanding influence in Peloponnese, while undermining Spartan hegemony through diplomatic rather than military means. His advocacy for this policy demonstrated both strategic vision and willingness, taking risks more conservative leaders would avoid. Alcibiades' rise to prominence occurred during a period when Athenian democracy was experiencing significant generational change. as older leaders who'd guided city through Persian wars and early imperial expansion gave way to younger politicians whose political consciousness had been shaped by Peloponnesian conflict. Born around 450 BC, Alcibiades belonged to one of Athens' most distinguished families and received finest education available, including personal instruction from Socrates, developing intellectual capabilities while apparently failing to instill corresponding moral restraint. The young aristocrat's physical appearance and personal style contributed significantly to political appeal and public notoriety. Contemporary sources describe him as exceptionally handsome, with striking features and athletic build, Greeks associated with divine favor and heroic potential. His clothing and personal accessories reflected expensive tastes and deliberate ostentation, designed demonstrating superiority to ordinary citizens, while public behavior combined aristocratic arrogance with democratic accessibility in ways both attracting and scandalizing Athenian society. The Battle of Mantinea, that climaxed in 418 BC, provided decisive test of competing alliance systems while demonstrating continued superiority of traditional Spartan military methods when properly applied under favorable circumstances. The engagement occurred on plains south of Mantinea, where relatively open terrain favored hoplite formations and minimized tactical advantages light-armed troops had enjoyed in more broken country. The Spartan army, numbering approximately 9,000 hoplites, supported by cavalry and light troops, faced coalition force of similar size, including contingents from all four allied cities. The Spartan advance proceeded with measured pace and perfect alignment, making their phalanx formation legendary throughout Greek world. While bronze-faced shields and crimson cloaks created visual spectacle, intimidating opponents even before physical contact occurred. The rhythmic chanting of paeans and steady beat of flutes accompanying advance added psychological pressure, often breaking enemy formations before actual combat began. The collision between opposing phalanxes occurred with tremendous crash of bronze against bronze, characteristic of hoplite warfare, as hundreds of spear points struck shields and armor, while rear ranks pressed forward, maintaining momentum. Spartan superior training and conditioning quickly became apparent, as they maintained formation integrity while systematically pushing back opponents through coordinated pressure applied at precisely right moments. The collapse of coalition's right wing created cascade effect, spreading panic throughout entire formation, as soldiers observed their supposedly strongest contingent being systematically destroyed by Spartan pressure. The Argive center, already under severe pressure from Spartan allied forces, began falling back in disorder when news spread that Mantineans were in full retreat. The Athenian contingent positioned on coalition's left wing found itself increasingly isolated as remainder of allied army disintegrated around them. The casualties from Battle of Mantinea reflected engagement's decisive character and demonstrated effectiveness of traditional military methods when properly applied under favorable circumstances. Coalition forces lost approximately 1,100 men killed, including many most experienced officers and political leaders, while Spartan losses totaled fewer than 300 casualties. This favorable ratio reflected not only superior tactical performance, but psychological impact of Spartan military reputation, which had encouraged many enemy troops to flee rather than face certain death in hopeless combat. The political consequences of Mantinea extended far beyond immediate military results, fundamentally altering balance of power throughout Peloponnese, while restoring Spartan confidence in traditional methods and leadership. The destruction of Argive coalition eliminated most serious challenge to Spartan hegemony since Persian wars, while demonstrating military excellence, remained ultimate arbiter of political disputes, despite diplomatic innovations of previous decade. For Athens, defeat at Mantinea represented both military disaster and diplomatic humiliation, undermining aggressive policies advocated by Alcibiades, while vindicating Nicias's preference for cautious defensive strategies. Loss of Athenian prestige in Peloponnese eliminated opportunities for further expansion in that region, while demonstrating continued risks inherent in challenging Spartan power through direct military confrontation. The young Alcibiades, whose advocacy for Argive alliance had contributed directly to this disaster, found political position weakened despite skill in deflecting personal responsibility for defeat. However, rather than moderating ambitions in response to setback, Alcibiades began advocating for even more dramatic military adventures, restoring Athenian prestige, while providing opportunities for spectacular success, establishing his dominance in democratic politics. His attention turned increasingly towards Sicily, where complex political situation among Greek cities offered possibilities for intervention, achieving decisive victories, proven elusive in conventional theaters of operation. The seeds of Athens' greatest disaster were thus planted in aftermath of defeat at Mantinea, as frustrated ambition sought outlet through increasingly reckless strategic gambles. The diplomatic humiliation at Mantinea had scarcely faded from Athenian memory, when unexpected embassy arrived from distant Sicilian city of Segesta in winter 416 to 415 BC, bearing appeals for military assistance, ultimately leading Athens into most catastrophic adventure in its imperial history. The Segestans, locked in territorial dispute with neighbor Selinus over boundary lands and marriage rights, had initially sought support from traditional allies in mainland Greece, but found little enthusiasm for intervention in what appeared minor local conflict. Their decision approaching Athens reflected both desperation and shrewd calculation about Athenian imperial ambitions and democratic susceptibility to grandiose military projects. The Segestan ambassadors addressing Athenian assembly presented their case with considerable diplomatic skill, emphasizing not only immediate need for assistance but broader opportunities Sicilian intervention might provide for Athenian imperial expansion. They described Sicily as a wealthy island whose Greek cities possessed extensive resources and strategic positions, serving as stepping stones toward further expansion into Western Mediterranean. More provocatively, they hinted Syracuse, largest and most powerful Sicilian city, harbored ambitions dominating entire island, and might eventually threaten Athenian interests in southern Italy if allowed consolidating regional hegemony unchallenged. The assembly debate that followed revealed extent to which Athenian political culture had been transformed by decades of imperial expansion and democratic competition for popular favor. Nicias, now in his 60 seconds, and increasingly concerned about risks of overextension, attempted moderating popular enthusiasm by emphasizing enormous costs and uncertain benefits of Sicilian intervention. He pointed out Athens already faced significant challenges maintaining control over existing empire while managing ongoing tensions with Sparta, making it imprudent undertaking new commitments that might strain imperial resources beyond capacity. Alcibiades, however, seized upon Sicilian opportunity as exactly the kind of spectacular project restoring his political fortunes while providing Athens with decisive victory, proven elusive in conventional theaters of operation. The young aristocrat's speech to assembly, as recorded by Thucydides, revealed both strategic vision and understanding of popular psychology during a period when democratic institutions rewarded leaders promising dramatic results rather than cautious management of existing resources. He argued Athenian imperial power depended on constant expansion, and any pause in aggressive action would encourage challenges from existing enemies while disappointing allies expecting tangible benefits from association with Athens. The final assembly vote authorized expedition of unprecedented scale, reflecting both popular enthusiasm for project and democratic tendency supporting ambitious proposals once initial commitments had been made. The force approved for Sicilian operations included 60 triremes with full crews, 5,100 hoplites, drawn from both citizens and allied contingents, and substantial numbers of light-armed troops, archers, and cavalry providing tactical flexibility in unfamiliar terrain. Financial allocation exceeded 1,000 talents, representing one of largest single military expenditures in Athenian history, and demonstrating empire's confidence in capacity achieving decisive results through overwhelming force. The appointment of joint commanders for this massive expedition reflected both democratic preference for shared leadership and recognition that operations complexity required diverse skills and experience. Nicias received command despite opposition to entire project, reflecting popular respect for military competence and perhaps hope his caution might prevent reckless decisions characterizing some previous campaigns. Alcibiades' appointment acknowledged his role, advocating expedition, while providing opportunities, demonstrating strategic vision through practical results. Selection of Lamachus as third commander added experienced military leadership from officer whose entire career had been devoted to professional warfare rather than political advancement. However, the mutilation of Hermes, occurring on single night, shortly before fleet's scheduled departure, created scandal that would ultimately prove more destructive to Athenian interests than any military defeat. The systematic defacement of these sacred statues standing at street corners and outside private houses throughout Athens represented an act of unprecedented sacrilege, shocking entire citizenry, while raising fears about conspiracies against democratic institutions. The Hermes served not only religious functions as protective symbols dedicated to Hermes, but also civic purposes as markers of Athenian identity and community solidarity, making their mutilation attack on fundamental symbols of democratic culture. Alcibiades found himself at center of investigations when informants alleged his involvement in both Hermes mutilation and separate incidents involving profanation of Eleusinian mysteries at private drinking parties. These charges reflected both genuine evidence of participation in aristocratic religious violations and political calculation by enemies, recognizing scandal might eliminate their most dangerous rival. The young politician's lifestyle, always including behavior conventional citizens found shocking, now became focus of public attention as prosecutors argued personal conduct revealed contempt for democratic values and religious obligations. The compromise emerging from these debates satisfied no one, while creating conditions proving ultimately disastrous for both Alcibiades and expedition itself. Assembly voted allowing fleet departing on schedule with Alcibiades retaining command, but with understanding he'd return to face trial once initial operations had been completed and military responsibilities could be transferred to colleagues. This arrangement preserved expedition's leadership structure while maintaining appearance of taking religious charges seriously, but also ensured scandal would continue festering and potentially explode at worst possible moment. The fleet's departure from Piraeus in June 415 BC created spectacle, impressing even citizens accustomed to impressive displays of Athenian naval power. The 134 triremes departed in organized formations, demonstrating both tactical discipline and ceremonial magnificence, their bronze-reinforced rams gleaming in morning sun, while crews sang paeans, celebrating Athenian glory and imperial destiny. The sight of so many vessels moving in coordinated precision across waters of Saronic Gulf provided visible evidence of empire's military capabilities, while inspiring confidence such overwhelming force could achieve any objective. Democratic will might establish. The recall of Alcibiades, occurring just as serious military operations were beginning, eliminated expedition's most innovative strategic thinker, while creating political crisis, having devastating consequences for both campaign and Athenian domestic politics. The state trireme Salaminia arrived at Catana with orders for Alcibiades, returning immediately to face charges related to Herm's mutilation and religious profanation. Reflecting Assembly's decision scandals required resolution regardless of impact on military operations. Alcibiades' response to recall order revealed both political acumen and fundamental lack of loyalty to democratic institutions when they conflicted with personal interests. Rather than returning to Athens to face charges that might result in exile or death, he chose fleeing to Sparta, where intimate knowledge of Athenian strategic planning and military capabilities would provide enormous advantages to Athens' primary enemy. His defection represented not only personal betrayal, but strategic catastrophe, as he possessed detailed information about expeditions' objectives, resources, and weaknesses, enabling Spartan countermeasures. The strategic advice Alcibiades provided to Spartan assembly demonstrated both thorough understanding of Athenian vulnerabilities and willingness damaging native cities' interests in pursuit of personal revenge. He urged Spartans sending immediate military assistance to Syracuse, arguing Athenian success in Sicily would provide resources and strategic positions for further expansion, ultimately threatening Spartan interests throughout Mediterranean. More devastatingly, he recommended Sparta establish permanent fortified base at Decelia in northern Attica position, enabling year-round pressure on Athenian territory, while disrupting agricultural and mining activities, providing essential imperial revenues. The siege of Syracuse, dominating expedition's final phase, revealed both impressive capabilities of Athenian military engineering and ultimate inadequacy of even superior force when applied without clear strategic vision or adequate resources. Athenians established elaborate siege works demonstrating mastery of advanced military techniques, including crosswalls, designed to isolate city from external support, and sophisticated naval installations controlling access to Syracuse's great harbor. These fortifications represented remarkable achievements of military engineering, showcasing Athenian technical capabilities while providing effective tactical advantages during siege's initial phases. However, sheer scale of siege operations strained Athenian resources while revealing expeditions' fundamental logistical vulnerabilities. Maintenance of extensive siege works required enormous quantities of materials and labor transported across vast distances, while need to guard against external relief efforts dispersed Athenian forces across multiple positions that couldn't provide mutual support. Arrival of Gylippus with Spartan reinforcements exploited these vulnerabilities by coordinating external attacks with Syracusan sorties, gradually eroding Athenian positions while inflicting casualties that couldn't be replaced. The naval battles in Syracuse's great harbor marked beginning of expedition's final collapse as Athenian maritime supremacy foundation of all imperial strategy faced its most serious challenge since Persian wars. Confined waters of harbor negated many traditional advantages of Athenian seamanship, while favoring heavier construction and ramming tactics Syracusan shipwrights had developed specifically for these conditions. Systematic modification of Syracusan triremes, including reinforced prows and additional protective timbers, reflected sophisticated understanding of local tactical requirements, demonstrating technical innovation could overcome even significant disparities in crew experience and training. The decisive naval engagement sealing expedition's fate occurred in September 413 BC, when remaining Athenian fleet, now reduced to fewer than 60 operational triremes, attempted forcing passage out of Great Harbor, while carrying armies' surviving personnel to safety. Syracusans had prepared for this breakout attempt by positioning entire fleet across harbor mouth, while constructing underwater obstacles, channeling Athenian ships into predetermined killing zones. The battle that followed demonstrated both desperation of Athenian efforts and effectiveness of Syracusan defensive preparations, as superior numbers and favorable positioning overcame Athenian tactical superiority. The destruction of Athenian fleet in Great Harbor eliminated any possibility of evacuation by sea and forced surviving army attempting escape overland through hostile territory where every advantage favored their enemies. The retreat that followed represented one of most catastrophic military disasters in Greek history, as approximately 40,000 Athenians and allied troops began march toward friendly territory while harassed by cavalry, light troops, and local populations viewing them as invaders deserving no mercy. Psychological impact of naval defeat had already demoralized army, while inadequate supplies and constant attacks gradually reduced their numbers and effectiveness. Picture the horror. Thousands of men stumbling through Sicilian countryside, wounded and exhausted, dying of thirst under merciless sun. Syracusan cavalry riding alongside the column, picking off stragglers with javelins, laughing at their helplessness. The desperate crossing of Aegean River, where Athenians crazed with thirst trampled each other trying to reach water while enemy missiles rained down from both banks. The river running red with blood, as thousands drowned or were slaughtered in shallows, their bodies damming the stream. Those who survived the crossing collapsing on far bank, too exhausted to continue, waiting numbly for capture or death. The final surrender of Athenian forces at Aegean River marked complete destruction of most ambitious military expedition in Athenian history and eliminated nearly one-third empire's total military manpower in single, catastrophic defeat. Survivors numbering perhaps 7,000 men faced imprisonment in Syracuse's stone quarries under conditions proving fatal for most within months of capture. The execution of Nicias and Demosthenes, despite Gylippus's attempts preserving them as valuable prisoners, reflected Syracuse's determination, demonstrating complete victory while eliminating leaders who might organize future resistance or escape attempts. The strategic consequences of Sicilian disaster extended far beyond immediate military impact, fundamentally altering balance of power throughout Greek world, while encouraging challenges to Athenian imperial control that would ultimately prove fatal to empire itself. Loss of so many experienced troops, naval crews, and military commanders eliminated much of professional expertise, enabling Athenian military success, while enormous financial costs of expedition exhausted imperial reserves and forced increased tribute demands, provoking widespread resentment among allied cities. Most significantly, demonstration of Athenian vulnerability encouraged both existing enemies and previously neutral powers, viewing empire as declining force, whose defeat had become not only possible, but probable. The catastrophic destruction of Sicilian expedition transformed strategic landscape of Greek world more dramatically than any single event since Xerxes' invasion 70 years earlier. News of disaster reached Athens in autumn 413 BC through series of increasingly desperate messages chronicling expedition's final collapse, creating shockwaves reverberating through every level of Athenian society. Initial reports delivered by surviving sailors who'd escaped Syracuse's harbor aboard damaged vessels seemed so incredible, many citizens refused believing them until official confirmation arrived from few officers who'd managed reaching friendly territory in southern Italy. Sparta's response to news of Athenian catastrophe revealed both strategic acumen and recognition. Balance of power had shifted decisively in their favor for first time since war's beginning. Spartan assembly, guided by Alcibiades' intimate knowledge of Athenian vulnerabilities, immediately authorized comprehensive strategy characterizing conflict's final phase. Rather than simply resuming seasonal invasions of Attica proving ineffective during Archidamian War, they'd implement coordinated campaign designed exploiting Athenian weakness through simultaneous pressure on multiple fronts. The establishment of permanent fortified base at Decilia, represented most innovative aspect of this new Spartan strategy, transforming traditional pattern of seasonal warfare into year-round pressure, systematically strangling Athenian economic capacity. The site, located approximately 14 miles north of Athens, on main route connecting city to silver mines at Laurium, had been selected through careful reconnaissance, identifying strategic advantages for disrupting Athenian communications and supply lines. King Agis II personally supervised construction of Decelia fortifications during winter 413 to 412 BC, employing Peloponnesian League engineers who'd gained expertise in military construction during previous campaigns. The resulting complex included not only defensive walls and towers designed withstanding siege operations, but permanent barracks, supply depots, and administrative facilities, enabling sustained occupation regardless of seasonal variations or enemy pressure. The immediate impact of Decelia occupation exceeded even Spartan expectations, as fortress effectively severed Athens' land communications with northern Attica and eliminated access to Laurium silver mines, providing crucial imperial revenues. Athenian farmers throughout region abandoned properties rather than face constant raids, while merchants and travelers found main roads too dangerous for normal commercial activity. The psychological effect proved equally significant, as Athenian citizens could observe smoke rising from burning farmsteads while being unable, preventing systematic destruction of their territory's economic infrastructure. The disruption of silver mining operations represented particularly devastating blow to Athenian financial capacity, as Laurium mines had provided both direct revenues through state ownership and indirect benefits through taxation of private mining operations. The mine's complex infrastructure, including elaborate drainage systems and processing facilities, required constant maintenance, becoming impossible under conditions of continuous military pressure. Skilled slave workers operating these facilities began deserting in large numbers, seeking refuge at Decelia, where Spartan commanders offered protection and potential freedom in exchange for intelligence about Athenian defensive preparations. Simultaneously with establishing pressure on Athenian territory, Sparta initiated diplomatic and military campaign that would ultimately prove even more destructive to imperial interests. Systematic encouragement of revolts among Athenian allies throughout Aegean. Spartan strategy recognized Athens' fundamental vulnerability lay not in home territory, but in tribute-paying cities whose loyalty had been maintained through combination of military intimidation and economic incentives. Sicilian disaster had demonstrated Athenian military limitations while creating financial pressures, forcing increased tribute demands, providing ideal conditions for encouraging widespread defections. The revolt of Chios in spring 412 BC marked beginning of this broader imperial collapse and demonstrated both sophistication of Spartan planning and extent of Athenian weakness following Sicilian catastrophe. Chios had remained one of Athens' most reliable allies throughout war's early phases, contributing ships rather than tribute and maintaining substantial autonomy in domestic affairs. However, Island's oligarchic leadership had maintained covert communications with Spartan agents, waiting for favorable circumstances, declaring independence, while minimizing risks of Athenian retaliation. The coordination between Spartan military action and Persian financial support represented fundamental shift in war's character, introducing third major power, whose resources and strategic objectives would ultimately determine conflict's outcome. Persian decision to intervene reflected both recognition of opportunities created by Greek exhaustion and desire recovering Anatolian territories lost during previous century of Greek expansion. Satrap Tissaphernes, governing western regions of Persian Empire from capital at Sardis, had been monitoring Greek affairs closely while building relationships with potential allies serving Persian interests. The initial agreement between Sparta and Tissaphernes, negotiated through intermediaries, understanding both Greek political culture and Persian administrative methods established framework for cooperation, characterizing war's final phase. Persians agreed, providing financial subsidies, enabling Spartan naval construction and maintenance while supporting revolts among Athenian allies possessing strategic value for Persian objectives. In return, Sparta acknowledged Persian sovereignty over Greek cities of Asia Minor, effectively abandoning liberation rhetoric, justifying their intervention in region during Persian wars. This diplomatic revolution created profound ideological contradictions. Both sides attempted minimizing through careful propaganda and selective emphasis on immediate tactical advantages. Spartans, who traditionally presented themselves as liberators of Greek cities from Athenian tyranny, now found themselves allied with Persian Empire, previously threatening Greek independence. Arrangement required sophisticated justification, emphasizing temporary nature of Persian cooperation, while arguing Athenian imperial oppression represented greater immediate threat to Greek freedom than distant Persian sovereignty. The oligarchic revolution, convulsing Athens during 411 BC, emerged directly from military and financial pressures created by imperial revolts and failure of democratic institutions, developing effective responses to unprecedented crisis. Movement's leaders, including prominent figures such as Antiphon, Peisander, and Theramenes, exploited popular frustration with military defeats while arguing constitutional changes were necessary, securing Persian support, enabling imperial recovery. Their propaganda combined genuine strategic analysis with deliberate manipulation of democratic fears and prejudices. The oligarchic conspiracy had been developing for months before actual coup occurred, with participants maintaining careful secrecy while building networks of support among citizens who'd become disillusioned with democratic leadership. Conspirators recognized open advocacy for oligarchy would provoke immediate resistance, so initially focused on more limited constitutional reforms, attracting broader support. Their proposals emphasized need for more efficient decision-making and expert leadership, while avoiding explicit attacks on democratic principles, uniting opposition against them. The actual implementation of oligarchic coup in May 411 BC revealed both conspirators' organizational skills and extent to which democratic institutions had been weakened by military failures and social disruption. Revolution began with assassination of prominent democratic leaders, including Androcles, who'd been instrumental in Alcibiades' exile and remained committed to traditional constitutional arrangements. These targeted killings created an atmosphere of terror, discouraging resistance while eliminating potential leaders organizing effective opposition to constitutional changes. The establishment of the 400 Oligarchic Council, assuming supreme authority over Athenian government, represented most dramatic constitutional change in city's democratic history. New regime immediately suspended traditional assembly meetings while transferring executive authority to small group of wealthy citizens, claiming superior expertise in military and financial matters. Their propaganda emphasized temporary nature of these arrangements, while promising broader constitutional reform would eventually create more effective governmental structures. However, oligarchic government's actual policies revealed fundamental contradictions between promises of improved effectiveness and pursuit of narrow class interests, alienating potential supporters while failing addressing empire's strategic challenges. The 400 proved no more capable than democratic predecessors of developing successful responses to military pressures created by Spartan-Persian cooperation, while domestic policies created additional social tensions, weakening rather than strengthening Athenian capacity for sustained resistance. The naval mutiny at Samos, occurring simultaneously with domestic constitutional crisis, demonstrated empire's continued military potential, while revealing complex relationship between political legitimacy and military effectiveness. Athenian fleet stationed at Samos, composed largely of citizens from lower economic classes, excluded from oligarchic government, declared loyalty to democratic institutions while refusing recognizing 400's authority. Their resistance created bizarre situation where two competing Athenian governments claimed legitimate authority while pursuing contradictory policies. The Samian fleet's decision, recalling Alcibiades from Persian territory, represented both desperate attempt restoring effective leadership and recognition traditional political divisions had become secondary to empire's survival. Requirements: former exiles returned to Athenian service despite previous defection to Sparta and collaboration with Persian authorities, demonstrated extent to which military crisis had transformed normal political calculations. His appointment as naval commander reflected not forgiveness for past betrayals, but recognition his strategic expertise and Persian connections might provide advantages other leaders couldn't offer. The overthrow of 400 in September 411 BC occurred through combination of popular resistance and moderate oligarchic opposition, reflecting both regimes' practical failures and persistence of democratic political culture. Immediate trigger came when news arrived oligarchs were negotiating surrender terms with Sparta, creating outrage among citizens viewing such discussions as treasonous regardless of attitudes toward constitutional reform. Moderate opposition, led by Theramenes, exploited this popular anger while positioning themselves as defenders of Athenian independence rather than advocates for pure democracy. The restoration of democratic institutions in Athens coincided with remarkable naval revival, demonstrating empire's resilience even under most desperate circumstances. Fleet stationed at Samos, having maintained loyalty to democratic principles throughout oligarchic crisis, became foundation for series of spectacular victories, temporarily restoring Athenian confidence while proving superior seamanship could still overcome numerical advantages Persian gold had provided to Spartan naval forces. The key to this revival lay not merely in ships themselves, but in experienced crews who'd remained loyal and innovative commanders, understanding how to exploit tactical opportunities created by enemy overconfidence. Thrasyllus emerged as one of most effective of these new naval commanders, representing generation of professional officers whose careers had been forged in crucible of imperial warfare rather than traditional aristocratic networks. His background as hoplite, who'd risen through ranks based on demonstrated competence rather than family connections, gave him credibility with common sailors, whose support was essential for effective naval operations. More importantly, his tactical innovations reflected careful study of recent Spartan naval improvements and systematic development of countermeasures, restoring Athenian advantages in ship-to-ship combat. The Battle of Cynossema in late 411 BC provided first demonstration of these tactical innovations and marked beginning of Athens' naval resurgence in face of seemingly impossible odds. The engagement occurred in narrow waters of Hellespont, where Spartan Admiral Mindarus had positioned fleet of 86 ships to intercept Athenian grain convoys, while maintaining control over crucial sea route connecting Black Sea with Aegean. Spartan position appeared strategically sound, as superior numbers and confined waters would prevent kind of complex maneuvering traditionally, giving Athenian triremes tactical advantages. The battle's opening phase proceeded exactly as Mindarus anticipated, with center and right wing achieving initial success against apparently outnumbered Athenian forces. However, this pursuit brought Spartan ships into precisely position Thrasyllus planned. Exploiting hidden Athenian reserves emerged from concealed positions, while main Athenian lines suddenly reversed course and engaged pursuers with coordinated ramming attacks, catching scattered Spartan vessels in vulnerable positions. Superior training and discipline of Athenian crews became immediately apparent as they executed complex maneuvers with precision while maintaining formation integrity under combat conditions, causing less experienced sailors to panic. The Battle of Abydos, fought several months later, in spring 410 BC, confirmed these tactical lessons, while demonstrating effectiveness of coordinated operations, combining naval superiority with amphibious assault capabilities. Alcibiades, having established credentials through successful diplomatic negotiations with Persian authorities, assumed overall command of Athenian forces in Hellespont region and immediately began implementing kind of comprehensive strategy. Characterizing his earlier military planning, his approach integrated naval operations with land-based activities while exploiting local political divisions Persian policy had inadvertently created. The Battle of Cyzicus in 410 BC represented culmination of this naval revival and provided Athens with its most spectacular victory since capture of Spartan forces at Sphacteria 15 years earlier. The engagement occurred when Mindarus, desperate to restore Spartan naval prestige following defeats at Cynossema, and Abydos, assembled largest Peloponnesian fleet of entire war for decisive confrontation, either eliminating Athenian naval power or demonstrating futility of continued resistance. His force included not only Spartan vessels but substantial contingents from Corinth, Syracuse, and other allied cities, whose participation reflected continued commitment to anti-Athenian coalition. Alcibiades' strategy for Cyzicus campaign demonstrated mastery of complex military operations, integrating deception, coordination, and tactical innovation to achieve overwhelming superiority at decisive point. Athenian fleet approached enemy position in 3 separate squadrons, appearing to operate independently, creating impression they lacked unified command, while actually executing carefully coordinated plan designed, exploiting Spartan tactical assumptions. This deception required extraordinary discipline from individual ship commanders who had to maintain assigned positions while resisting natural tendency, concentrating forces when facing superior enemy numbers. The battle's opening phase proceeded according to Alcibiades' plan, as Mindarus deployed entire fleet, engaging what appeared isolated Athenian squadron under Alcibiades' direct command. However, appearance of remaining Athenian squadrons at precisely moment when Spartan fleet was fully committed to attack transformed tactical situation completely. Thrasyllus and Theramenes emerged from concealed positions with combined forces, creating 3-2 numerical advantage, while catching enemy fleet in extended formation that couldn't respond effectively to attacks from multiple directions. The destruction of Spartan fleet at Cyzicus exceeded even Athenian expectations, as enemy resistance collapsed with unprecedented speed once tactical situation became clear. Peloponnesian vessels, caught in unfavorable positions and unable executing coordinated defensive maneuvers, fell victim to kind of systematic destruction superior seamanship could inflict under optimal conditions. Athenian crews, inspired by recent victories and fighting with desperation of men understanding defeat, would mean empire's end, pressed attacks with relentless efficiency, leaving no opportunity for enemy recovery. The capture or destruction of entire Spartan fleet eliminated Peloponnesian naval power in Aegean, while providing Athens with material resources, temporarily alleviating financial pressures created by loss of tribute revenues. More than 60 enemy vessels fell into Athenian hands, along with crews and substantial quantities of Persian gold intended financing continued operations. Psychological impact proved even more significant than these material gains, as victory demonstrated Athenian naval supremacy could be restored, despite empire's apparent decline. The death of Mindarus during final phase of battle eliminated most competent Spartan naval commander, while symbolically marking end of their brief period of maritime competitiveness. The dramatic return of Alcibiades to Athens in 407 BC marked one of most remarkable political resurrections in Greek history. The man who'd fled city 8 years earlier, under charges of sacrilege and treason, now returned as architect of spectacular military victories, restoring imperial fortunes when all seemed lost. His triumphant entry into Piraeus harbor, leading fleet laden with captured enemy vessels and Persian gold, created scenes of popular enthusiasm, demonstrating Athenian democracy's capacity for both vindictiveness and forgiveness. When political calculations aligned with military success, the elaborate ceremonies accompanying Alcibiades' restoration to favor reflected both popular gratitude for military achievements and careful political management designed legitimizing return while minimizing references to previous betrayals. Democratic Assembly voted restoring property and civic rights while formally absolving him of religious charges originally driving him into exile. More significantly, they elected him to prestigious position of strategos autocrator, granting unprecedented military authority, reflecting both recognition of strategic competence and acknowledgement desperate circumstances required exceptional leadership. Arrangements, however, very qualities making Alcibiades effective as military commander and popular leader, also contained seeds of ultimate downfall. His aristocratic arrogance and personal extravagance created resentment among democratic politicians, viewing him as threat to traditional constitutional arrangements, while strategic boldness led to risky decisions, transforming spectacular success into catastrophic failure. Expectations created by recent victories placed enormous pressure achieving continued success, while political enemies who'd never forgiven previous betrayals waited for opportunities exploiting any setbacks. The Battle of Notium in 407 BC marked beginning of Lysander's challenge to restored Athenian naval confidence and demonstrated how quickly tactical superiority could be lost when overconfidence led to strategic miscalculations. The engagement occurred when Alcibiades, confident in recent victories and eager maintaining aggressive momentum, characterizing return to favor, departed from main fleet to conduct diplomatic negotiations with potential allies. His absence left fleet under command of subordinate Antiochus, experienced pilot, whose tactical competence was unquestioned, but strategic judgment would prove fatally flawed. Antiochus had received explicit instructions avoiding major engagements while Alcibiades remained absent, reflecting recognition political consequences of defeat would be catastrophic, regardless of tactical significance. However, proximity of Lysander's fleet and provocative nature of Spartan naval maneuvers created pressures testing subordinate commanders' discipline and judgment. When Spartan vessels began conducting aggressive reconnaissance near Athenian anchorage, Antiochus faced difficult choice between appearing cowardly through inaction or risking unauthorized combat, achieving spectacular results. The tactical engagement that followed revealed both continued effectiveness of Athenian naval training and fatal consequences of fighting under unfavorable strategic conditions. Antiochus led small squadron against what appeared isolated portion of Spartan fleet, expecting quick success through superior seamanship before withdrawing to main anchorage safety. However, Lysander had carefully prepared this apparent opportunity as trap, positioning majority of forces where they could intervene decisively once Athenian vessels were committed to combat. The destruction of Antiochus and 15 Athenian triremes provided Lysander with exactly kind of tactical victory, establishing reputation while undermining confidence in Alcibiades' leadership. Political consequences of Notium proved even more devastating for Alcibiades than immediate military losses, as enemies in Athens seized upon defeat as evidence restoration had been premature and dangerous. Democratic Assembly, which had celebrated return with such enthusiasm only months earlier, now subjected him to harsh criticism, reflecting both genuine concern about military competence and political calculation by opponents who'd never accepted rehabilitation. The final exile of Alcibiades, following removal from command in 406 BC, marked end of most remarkable political career in Athenian history and eliminated empire's most innovative strategic thinker at precisely moment when such leadership was most desperately needed. His departure from Athenian service represented not only personal tragedy but strategic catastrophe, as intimate knowledge of Athenian capabilities and Persian politics would once again become available to enemies exploiting such intelligence for maximum advantage. The construction and deployment of new Spartan fleets financed by Cyrus the Younger represented most serious long-term threat to Athenian naval revival, as Persian resources enabled sustained maritime competition previously impossible for land-based powers. Cyrus, younger son of King Darius II, had been appointed overseeing Persian interests in western Anatolia, with specific instructions, preventing decisive Athenian victory while maintaining regional balance, serving Persian strategic objectives. His youth and ambition made him more willing than Tissaphernes, providing substantial military support, while access to royal treasury enabled financial commitments dwarfing previous Persian involvement in Greek affairs. Lysander's appointment as Navarch to command these new Persian-subsidized forces brought to Spartan naval operations kind of strategic vision and tactical innovation previously lacking in maritime efforts. Unlike previous Spartan naval commanders attempting to adapt traditional military methods to naval warfare, Lysander understood success required fundamentally different approaches, exploiting unique characteristics of maritime combat. The Battle of Aegian in summer 406 BC provided Athens' hastily assembled fleet with opportunity. Demonstrating Athenian naval capabilities remained formidable, despite Empire's desperate strategic situation. The engagement occurred when Callicratidas, who'd succeeded Lysander as Spartan Navarch under annual rotation system, established blockade of Mytilene with 140 ships, attempting forcing surrender of Canaan's fleet, trapped in harbor. Following unsuccessful attempt, relieving besieged city. Spartan commanders' position appeared strategically sound, as superior numbers and control of harbor approaches would eventually force either desperate breakout attempt or capitulation through starvation. The Athenian relief fleet sailing from Piraeus to challenge this blockade represented largest naval force Athens had assembled since Sicilian expedition, with 8 strategoi commanding 150 triremes, whose crews included veterans of previous campaigns, alongside newly trained personnel whose combat experience remained limited. Fleet organization reflected careful attention to tactical coordination, with individual squadrons assigned specific roles in complex battle plan commanders had developed during voyage across Aegean. The battle's opening phase proceeded with methodical precision characteristic of major naval engagements, as both fleets advanced in parallel lines, while individual ship commanders prepared for complex maneuvering, determining engagement's outcome. Morning sun reflected off bronze ram fittings and polished shields as 290 triremes moved across relatively calm waters, crews chanting paeans while maintaining steady rhythm necessary for coordinated movement. The collision between opposing battle lines occurred with tremendous crash of bronze against timber, marking beginning of ship-to-ship combat, as individual vessels attempted ramming enemy hulls while avoiding similar attacks from combated multiple directions. Superior training of Athenian crews became immediately apparent, as they executed complex maneuvers required for effective ramming, while maintaining sufficient spacing, avoiding collisions with friendly vessels. Callicratidas fell early in engagement when flagship became isolated during aggressive attack, bringing it within range of multiple Athenian vessels, whose coordinated assault overwhelmed Spartan crew. Despite superior equipment, training, Spartan commanders' death eliminated unified enemy leadership, while providing Athenian forces with visible evidence of tactical success, creating psychological momentum, spreading throughout both fleets, as individual ship commanders observed enemy admirals' fate. The systematic destruction of enemy resistance that followed demonstrated effectiveness of Athenian naval methods when applied under favorable circumstances by properly trained and adequately equipped crews. Spartan fleet lost 77 vessels captured or destroyed, while Athenian casualties totaled only 25 ships, reflecting both superior tactical performance and psychological impact of early success, encouraging enemy crews to flee rather than fight hopeless battles. However, political aftermath of this spectacular military success revealed extent to which prolonged warfare and democratic suspicion had corrupted Athenian political culture, transforming what should have been celebration into recrimination and judicial murder. Failure to rescue survivors from 25 lost Athenian vessels became focus of intense controversy when families of dead demanded explanations for why relatives had been abandoned to drown in Aegean waters while victorious fleet pursued fleeing enemies. The trial of 6 surviving strategoi who'd commanded at Arginusae represented one of most shameful episodes in Athenian democratic history, demonstrating how popular institutions could be manipulated by demagogues, exploiting legitimate grief for partisan political advantage. Prosecution argued commanders had prioritized pursuit of tactical victory over fundamental obligation preserving Athenian lives, citing specific instances where rescue operations might have been conducted if proper priorities had been established. These charges resonated with popular audiences who'd lost family members while failing understanding tactical realities, making rescue operations impossible under combat conditions. The Assembly's decision, trying all 6 commanders collectively rather than individually, violated established legal procedures while creating conditions making effective defense impossible. Traditional Athenian law required separate trials for each defendant, allowing proper examination of individual responsibilities and circumstances justifying particular decisions. Collective trial, demanded by demagogues understanding individual proceedings, might result in acquittals, ensured popular anger, could overwhelm legal protections, while preventing detailed analysis of tactical situation, making rescue operations impossible. The execution of 6 strategoi in late 406 BC eliminated some of Athens' most experienced naval commanders, while demonstrating to potential successors military success provided no protection against democratic vengeance when political calculations favored punishment over justice. Among executed was Pericles, the younger son of great statesmen, whose death symbolized extent to which Athenian political culture had deteriorated since his father's era. Loss of such experienced leadership at moment when empire faced greatest crisis represented strategic suicide, having consequences extending far beyond immediate military considerations. Lysander's return to naval command in 405 BC, despite technical violation of Spartan law, prohibiting individuals serving consecutive terms, as Navarch reflected both proven competence and Spartan recognition desperate. Circumstances required exceptional leadership arrangements. His reappointment as Epistolius, deputy commander, provided legal cover for what was essentially continuation of previous authority, while established relationships with Persian officials ensured continued financial support for Spartan naval operations. Return of such experienced leadership provided Sparta with crucial advantages at precisely moment when Athenian command structure had been weakened through political persecution. The systematic campaign Lysander initiated following return demonstrated both strategic sophistication and understanding of Athenian vulnerabilities, extending beyond purely military considerations. Rather than seeking immediate decisive battle, Spartan commander focused on methodically reducing Athenian influence throughout Aegean, while building networks of local support, ensuring lasting political changes favorable to Spartan interests. His approach combined military pressure with diplomatic initiatives, promising autonomy and oligarchic government to cities willing abandoning Athenian allegiances. The capture of Lampsacus in early 405 BC provided Lysander with crucial strategic base, controlling access to Hellespont, while demonstrating ability coordinating naval operations with amphibious assault capabilities. City's fortified position on Asiatic shore had made it key link in Athenian control over grain shipments from Black Sea, while substantial harbor facilities could support major naval operations throughout region. Systematic siege preceding its capture revealed both Spartan improvements in military engineering and Lysander's understanding lasting success required control over strategic positions rather than mere tactical victories. The Athenian response to Lampsacus's fall revealed both empires' continued military potential and strategic confusion resulting from loss of experienced leadership following Arginusae executions. Fleet sailing to challenge Lysander included 180 triremes with adequate crews and equipment, representing substantial commitment of remaining imperial resources, demonstrating Athens' determination, maintaining control over crucial 10 grain route. However, commanders appointed leading this expedition lacked both tactical expertise and strategic authority necessary for effective operations against opponent of Lysander's caliber. The positioning of Athenian fleet at Aegospotami across Hellespont from Lampsacus reflected both tactical necessity and strategic miscalculation, proving catastrophic for imperial interests. Beach where ships were drawn up provided adequate shelter from prevailing winds, while offering access to fresh water and supplies crews required for sustained operations. However, position also placed fleet in vulnerable location, where it could be observed continuously by Spartan scouts, while lacking adequate fortifications or escape routes, enabling effective response to enemy attack. The routine developing during 4 days preceding final battle revealed extent to which Athenian naval discipline had deteriorated under pressures of prolonged warfare and inadequate leadership. Each morning, fleet would deploy in battle formation and challenge Lysander to combat. But when Spartans declined engagement, Athenian crews would return to shore and disperse throughout surrounding area, gathering supplies and conducting personal business. This pattern, while reflecting understandable human needs for food and rest, created exactly kind of predictable vulnerability commander of Lysander's experience could exploit for maximum advantage. Lysander's careful observation of these Athenian routines reflected both tactical patience and strategic understanding. Decisive victory required optimal conditions, rather than hasty action, achieving only partial success. Spartan commander positioned scouts where they could monitor enemy activities while maintaining own fleet in state of readiness, enabling immediate action when favorable circumstances developed. His willingness, waiting for perfect tactical conditions, demonstrated kind of professional discipline, making him most effective Spartan naval commander of entire war. The attack at Aegospotami on 5th day caught dispersed Athenian crews in exactly vulnerable condition Lysander had anticipated, transforming what should have been routine deployment into complete catastrophe. Spartan fleet approached beach, while most Athenian personnel were scattered throughout countryside, leaving only skeleton crews aboard vessels that couldn't be manned quickly enough, responding effectively to surprise assault. Few ships managing to escape did so only because crews happened to be aboard when attack began, while remainder fell into enemy hands, along with nearly 3,000 prisoners, whose fate would demonstrate Spartan determination, achieving lasting victory. Picture that final morning. Athenian sailors scattered across countryside, some gathering firewood, others buying food from local farmers, many sleeping off previous night's wine. Then shouts of alarm as Spartan fleet appears around headland. 200 ships in perfect formation bearing down on exposed beach. Panic. Desperate men running toward their vessels. Commanders screaming orders no one can hear over chaos. A few ships managing to launch with skeleton crews. Oars churning frantically toward open sea. But 170 triremes beached, defenseless, their crews too dispersed to fight, falling into enemy hands without resistance. The execution of these prisoners, with sole exception of Athenian commander Adamantus, who was spared under suspicious circumstances, suggesting possible treachery, marked dramatic departure from traditional Greek warfare practices while sending unmistakable message about Spartan intentions regarding conflict's resolution. Lysander's decision massacring captives who'd traditionally have been ransomed or exchanged reflected both understanding war had reached decisive phase and determination, eliminating potential future resistance through terror. The strategic consequences of Aegospotami proved immediately apparent as Athenian control over Hellespont collapsed completely, cutting off grain supplies, sustaining urban population while eliminating tribute revenues, financing imperial administration. Loss of fleet meant Athens could no longer project power beyond Attica, while capture of so many experienced naval personnel eliminated human resources necessary, constructing replacement forces, even if financial means could somehow be found. The Siege of Athens, beginning in autumn 405 BC, represented culmination of nearly 3 decades of warfare, while demonstrating how completely strategic situation had been reversed since conflict's beginning. City that had once commanded tribute from hundreds of allied communities now found itself completely isolated, Spartan armies controlling land approaches, while Lysander's fleet prevented any possibility of relief by sea. Long walls providing security during previous invasions now became trapped, concentrating population in area where food supplies would be quickly exhausted without external support. The final surrender of Athens in April 404 BC marked not merely end of particular war, but collapse of entire world order, shaping Greek civilization for over half-century. Terms negotiated by exhausted Athenian assembly represented complete capitulation to Spartan demands, destruction of long walls, symbolizing Athenian security, reduction of fleet to 12 vessels suitable only for coastal patrol, and, most ominously, acceptance of government friendly to Sparta, ensuring permanent subordination to Peloponnesian interests. The physical demolition of Athens' fortifications began immediately, with Spartan engineers directing systematic destruction of walls whose construction had required decades of labor and enormous financial investment. Sound of hammers and crowbars echoing across Attic plain provided fitting soundtrack for death of most ambitious imperial project in Greek history. The establishment of 30 tyrants represented most radical transformation of Athenian political culture since overthrow of Pisistrated tyranny over century earlier. Oligarchic government imposed by Spartan authority included Critias and Theramenes, whose previous involvement in oligarchic revolution of 411 BC had provided experience in constitutional manipulation and networks of supporters among wealthy citizens suffering under democratic policies. The 30s' reign of terror eliminated approximately 1,500 victims within first few months, creating atmosphere of fear, paralyzing potential resistance. But resistance came. Thrasybulus, moderate democratic leader who distinguished himself during war, established base at Phyle Fortress in Attic Mountains with just 70 men. His force grew as exiles returned and citizens joined. The capture of Piraeus in early 403 BC transformed resistance into serious military challenge. The battle that followed saw Critias die fighting in Piraeus streets, his death marking oligarchic regime's beginning of end. Spartan king Pausanias, representing more moderate faction, negotiated settlement. The amnesty of 403 BC, one of most remarkable acts of political reconciliation in ancient history, prohibited prosecution for political activities during oligarchic period, with specific exceptions only for 30 themselves and direct collaborators. This unprecedented grant of immunity reflected both practical recognition. Continued conflict would benefit only Sparta and philosophical understanding. Successful democracy required integrating diverse social groups rather than eliminating political opponents. The restoration of democratic institutions proceeded gradually. The Peloponnesian War thus concluded not merely particular conflict between two Greek powers, but entire era of Greek historical development, beginning with Persian wars and reaching culmination in Athenian Empire's spectacular rise, catastrophic fall. The 27 years of warfare had demonstrated both remarkable achievements Greek civilization could accomplish and tragic limitations, ultimately proving fatal to its independence. The lessons learned from this great conflict would resonate throughout subsequent history, providing both inspiration for those seeking to understand dynamics of political power and warning for those attempting to build lasting empires based on democratic principles. In the end, the Peloponnesian War stands as history's greatest cautionary tale about the corrupting effects of power, dangers of imperial overextension, and eternal tension between democratic ideals and practical requirements of governing complex political systems in competitive international environment. Subscribe to Colossus of Empires for more epic journeys through history's greatest civilizations and conflicts that shaped our world.